I want you to think with me this morning along the theme of what Mark started with last week, which is thinking about what's really going on around the Christmas story. Sometimes when we hear the Christmas story, we just think, okay, well, I know that. You know, anything that's familiar can become a little too familiar, right? Just like, well, I know what happened. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and that's the story. So I want you to think with me this morning first about in any screenplay or story, if someone's writing a story, maybe in your favorite series that you watch on Netflix or something like that, in every one of those, all of that started from nothing. There wasn't anything, and then someone with real talent came along and they imagined, okay, there could be a story, and in that story I'm going to have what we call the protagonist, that's the good, the hero, the antagonist, that'd be the bad guy, and then we're going to have a bunch of other characters, and then as the story begins to unfold, they begin to introduce you to who those characters are and the role that they're going to have in the story. So this morning I want you to think a little broader with me about what's really going on here in the part of the story we're going to talk about this morning. Now, if you watch a movie, for instance, you might watch it. I'll just use this as an illustration. There's been 2 or 3 different Robin Hood movies that have come out, and each Robin Hood movie takes a little different bent on the story. And as you look at it, you think, well, I don't remember that part of the story before, or I never realized it took place there before. And I think that's a good illustration of what really goes on in the Bible, because you have to realize that you don't get the whole Christmas story in one place. So if you realize that the big story is the Bible, then you realize that the story of Christmas happens in the New Testament, and then the story of Christmas in the New Testament happens in a couple different places, both in the Gospel of Luke that we're focusing on this morning, and then also in the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew kind of took one little take on the story, and Luke took a different take. Now, you have to know that Luke's a doctor. Okay, so he's very interested in what's actually going on. So it's no surprise then that Luke actually gives the details about the birth because, I mean, he's a doctor, right? So think with me for a minute about what's going on in the story. The story begins, at least as we understand it, and that's the other thing. When you look at a story, anybody that writes a story or a screenplay or any of those, they don't give you all the facts. They give you enough to understand what it is that they want to talk about. Does that make sense? So anytime you watch a movie, you might think, well, I wonder what's really going on there. Or you might think, well, I wonder if they're going to do that, because anybody that's a good writer wants to leave you guessing, okay, what's going to happen next? What else might happen? And they don't always give you everything. And when we have the story of Christmas, we don't really get everything that's going on there either. So the story of Christmas really starts in Nazareth. And we find out that there's a young man named Joseph who came from Bethlehem. Now, the distance between Bethlehem and Nazareth, we're going to come back to this in a little bit, is the difference, if you know this, from Chattanooga to Farragut, just south of Knoxville. Okay? So I want you to picture that, get that in your mind. The distance between Chattanooga, and that would be the distance from Nazareth to Bethlehem, between Chattanooga and Farragut, south of Knoxville. We'll come back to that. So at one point, Joseph lived, or his family lived, in Bethlehem. And then somewhere along the way, this is one of those, we don't get that part of the story, somewhere along the way, the family relocated, or Joseph perhaps himself relocated to Nazareth. Now you think, well, shoot, it's only from here to Farragut. Yeah, that's because you drive. But imagine how far that is if you're walking. Okay? So I want you to think about that relocation scenario. It's kind of like if you lived on the East Coast and you moved to the West Coast. Okay, so the East Coast, I know I've lived on both. It's not the same out in the East Coast as it is in the West Coast. So in the story here, I want you to picture that the way it is in Bethlehem isn't necessarily the way it is in Nazareth. So we find out that Joseph's relocated there, and he's got his business there. And whenever you relocate to a new location, what do you have to do? Anybody? What do you have to do? Say again. Okay, well, what you have to make friends, right? You have to get to know people. So it can be awkward, right? If you're in a new place and you move in and you don't really know anybody and you think, well, maybe I should go talk to the neighbors, or, I better get to know somebody in my new job at work or something, because it's really kind of awkward until you begin to develop some relationships. So I want you to imagine what it must have been like for Joseph to be living in a place that wasn't really home, but it was now. Now, I also want you to realize that to really get this story, you have to get your mind out of modern Western culture. First of all, because the story doesn't take place in the United States. And second, because the West has a different way of looking at things than they do in the East. Now, you're going to say, well, yeah, but this all took place within the Roman Empire, and wasn't that basically a Western mindset? Well, yes, but this took place in Palestine. And that was on the border, and it was really an Eastern mindset. Plus, you have to realize that that was a day when everything was centered around community. Okay? We live in a world today where everything is centered around self. We live in what we call a self-centered culture. Up until the late 1800s, when that changed from community to self, everybody lived in community. So Mark's talked about this, how it would have been a larger family scenario that people live in. So there might have been grandparents and parents and kids and brothers and sisters, and they might have lived in a compound. And it wasn't like we perceive today, where everybody kind of does their own thing and lives their own way. And if you're young, you might live with your parents, or if you're empty nester, but it's different than it was then. And then there's a whole different understanding. We're not going to go into all of it this morning, but betrothal, the idea that you're going to get into a relationship with somebody and make a promise to each other, was a whole lot different than, yeah, we're dating and we're thinking about getting engaged, maybe, I don't know, we're still talking about it. It was a whole different thing. Betrothal was more like a contract. It was more like signing a business deal. So if you were going to betroth somebody's daughter, like Joseph decided to do with Mary, then you had to come to some kind of an arrangement with the parents. And if you could come to an arrangement with the parents, then you could be in the relationship with the daughter. Now, some of you are thinking, yeah, I'm glad I didn't have to negotiate with my in-laws before I got my wife. Well, it was a different culture, and it was a different way of seeing things. So Joseph is living in Nazareth, and he's in this relationship with Mary, and then something happens, right? This is the part of the story we're very, very familiar with. An angel shows up to Mary and speaks to Mary and conveys this message that God has found favor with you, and you're going to have a baby. Now, come on, ladies, just imagine if you're maybe 14, 15 years old, and you're in a relationship that your dad has arranged for you, because it was all arranged marriages, right? So he's arranged this relationship for you, and you and Joseph are getting to know each other. And the message from the angel is you're going to be pregnant and have a baby, and you're thinking, huh? Okay. Think about how it must have been for Mary. The sense of God's found favor with you, that was a little hard to understand right from the beginning. And then letting it sink in that something amazing, significant, you were going to be the vessel through which God himself became man on earth. Okay, well, that works until the unexpected happens, when you have to then explain the unexpected. So sometimes it's one thing to feel the blessing of God, the move of God, the hand of God. We describe it different ways. But then when you have to explain that to somebody else, and they're not quite sure what that's really all about, and if you were a young girl in that culture, to have to run around telling people, oh, yes, I'm pregnant, and it's God. God's going to be inside me. People might have wondered a little bit what was really going on with you at that point. So I want you to think about the story, and I want you to think about what it was like for Mary to then have to tell Joseph, who was in this arranged relationship, guess what? I'm pregnant. I can just imagine Joseph thinking, yeah, well, it ain't by me. The story makes it really clear that that was the case. And what it was like for the two of them who were in this contracted relationship, but yet weren't technically married, to have to try to figure out what they were going to do about this pregnancy. And Matthew does a good job of explaining to us in his gospel that an angel spoke to Joseph and said, listen, I'm doing something here, God's doing something, you need to go with it. And Joseph decides that he's going to listen and follow through on that. But now we have another problem. Mary has to tell her mom and dad. Now, I want you to just get your head with me this morning in the mind of a teenage girl who's pregnant and has to tell her mom and dad, yeah, I'm pregnant. Of course, I'm not married, which is big time no in that culture. Maybe that was okay for her to have that conversation with her mom and dad. I don't know, because the story doesn't tell us what that relationship was like. It does tell us that reasonably soon after she made this out-of-town visit all the way to Judea to visit her cousin Elizabeth, and whether that was one of those situations where we're going to send you away so you don't have to be in our community and be pregnant and have to deal with all the stress of that, the story doesn't tell us. It's possible. But she went to spend time with Elizabeth. And then we come back to Mary somehow arrives back in Nazareth, and then the Roman Empire, on a regular basis, even like we do here in our country, took censuses. They wanted to know how many people do we have, and where are they, and most of it had to do with taxing. And so they find out that one of those censuses is going to happen, but that means that because Joseph is from the house of David and that line, he has to return home to Bethlehem. Okay, remember how far we said it was from Nazareth to Bethlehem? So reading into the story, we find out that Joseph and Mary are now going to make a journey the equivalent of walking from Chattanooga to Farragut. Not driving a car and being there in an hour and 15, an hour and 20 minutes. They're going to have to walk, which is going to take at least a week or more. Ladies, how would you like to ride on a donkey, 9 months pregnant, for a week through pretty rugged territory, an awful lot of which was not very safe? I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to have to do it. So Mary has a lot of challenges here as part of what I want you to see this morning. She's wanting to follow God. She's wanting to be the blessing to others as the vessel that is going to bear Jesus, and then Jesus is going to be the Savior of the world. But along the way, she has to deal with letting her husband know. We have to tell her parents. And then we have to make this incredible journey for a week with me being almost ready to give birth riding on a donkey. You get the picture. Now, mind you, lucky Mary, who's already gone through all these challenges, now has the challenge of, oh yeah, Joseph's family's from Bethlehem, so now I get to talk to the in-laws. So it's like it never stops, right? We go from one thing to another thing to another thing. And poor Mary, I mean, she's just trying to do what God asked her to do. She's trying to be faithful. She's trying to be the vehicle God wants her to be. And yet she's facing all these challenges along the way. I want to suggest to you this morning that that's not a lot different than most of us. Most of us face challenges in our life, whether they're anticipated or unanticipated, that we have to deal with, just like Mary had to deal with the challenges. So I'm going to suggest a few of those this morning and see if you can relate to what we're talking about. So Mary had to deal with family members who didn't exactly see everything the same way. You ever had that problem in your family, where not everybody has the same point of view you have? Aren't the holidays the most special time? They are, until you get together with family and they're like, what? Or how come we have to talk about that? Or I can't believe you think that. Or You've been there, so you know what I'm talking about. Or just the ongoing struggle of family when you're trying to live a certain way and follow certain beliefs and have a certain outlook on life, and not everybody in your family sees it that way. I know when I became a Christian, I was the first person in my family in several generations that decided to be a follower of Christ. You think everybody else was real excited about that decision? I promise you they were not. And I took a lot of flack for that decision because they didn't see things the same way I did. Okay, here's another example. What about when you have a job and you find out that the boss you have isn't quite what you were hoping for in a boss? And you have to go to work every day, and you have to think, how am I going to deal with that difficult challenge of engaging a boss, maintaining my integrity about what I believe and what's important and what values matter, particularly if your boss doesn't have that same point of view. Or maybe you decided that you took a job and that job turned out to be way more than you thought it was going to be. You're like, yeah. Of course, you can't just quit because you have to have an income in order to pay the bills and other things, but we have those kinds of challenges. Or maybe some unexpected event happened and you have a major financial challenge. And you're like, yeah, we've been putting money away in savings and we've been trying to prepare for something unexpected. Or maybe you're just living paycheck to paycheck and you're like, so now what am I supposed to do? So, or maybe you lose your job and you weren't expecting to lose your job. And you're like, well, so now what am I going to do? And I can tell you that challenges like that are no fun. One of the challenges among many that I've had in my journey is a few years back, Pam called me one day and said, hey, I think something's wrong outside the house. Of course, I was out of town, so I wasn't really sure what we were talking about. So I got home, and all of the concrete walkway around my house was cracked in two, and it had sunk about 3 inches. And I was like, okay, I think we have a problem here. And so after a lot of research and trying to figure out what happened, the long of the short of the story is my house had dropped 3 inches on one side of my house. So my house was sitting like this, and the only reason my house didn't slide down the hill is we built a deck on this side, and that deck literally stopped the house when the earthquake hit. Yes, we have earthquakes in this area. And then I discovered my insurance wasn't going to pay for that, and I discovered that it was going to cost me in the $60,000+ to fix my house. So it's too long of a story to tell, but suffice it to say, I ended up paying out of pocket that $60,000 to fix my house. Now, God made a way, and God has a way of doing that, but sometimes we face challenges like that, and we just don't know what we're supposed to do. Sometimes we face health challenges, right? We get sick, or we have some unexpected thing happen to us, and we're like, okay, so now what are we supposed to do? Is insurance going to cover that? Or what am I going to do if I can't work? Or those of us that have dealt with aging family members in the end of life and all the challenges that come with trying to deal with those kinds of situations with parents or others, and just try to be there and do everything you're supposed to do. So Mary's not really alone in the story. I'm hoping you can relate to Mary in some way, because we all face challenges just like Mary did. But I want you to really think with me this morning for a minute about what happened when Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem. Now, the story you and I know, because it's what it tells us in the text, is they showed up and there was what? No room at the inn. Well, why were they at the inn? I'm going to suggest to you, based on the culture and based on the understanding, and Mark and I have talked about this, it was highly likely that that wasn't the first place they went for housing. They had family there. He was from the lineage of David. The first place that they would have gone when they went home is to family. There probably would have been the kind of compound that Mark showed pictures of a few weeks ago, and they would have gone there, and they would have expected, hey, Do you have room for us? Well, whether there wasn't room or, oops, we're not having any unwed pregnant girl living in we're not going to have people talking about us here in the neighborhood. However it worked out, that's not where they ended up. So the next likely place, if you can't stay with family when you get into town, then where are you going to go? Hotel, motel, you're going to go someplace where you can get lodging. Only it was a census and everybody was in town. Have you ever had the experience of going somewhere? Now, many of you are planners, and so this would have never have happened to you, but maybe you're not, and maybe you thought, well, we're going to go somewhere and we'll just find a place to stay when we get there. And then when you got there, it was like, no room here, no room here, no room here. That's not a happy thing. That's kind of what was happening. I think that it's reasonable to expect that they would have gone to family first, then they would have gone to the inn. Now, poor Mary is 9 months pregnant. I mean, you don't want to be 9 months pregnant and have your husband say, sorry, there's no room at the inn. Yeah, where are we going? Okay. I thought you had this taken care of, Joseph. Whether he did or whether he didn't know or whatever the circumstances on the story doesn't tell us everything there. But suffice it to say, they were in a situation where they had to do something. Now, for me, the hero or heroine, whoever it was, of this story is whoever said, hey, we don't have room, but we do have a stable. Okay? We have a stable. You can stay in the stable. Because I would sure hate to be the one that said, I haven't got any room for the inn. Hey, I hope it works out for you. I don't want to be that person. So somebody, somewhere in the story, made a way for them to have a place, even if it was a stable, even if it wasn't in the best of circumstances. They were able to find a place to stay. If I'm Mary and Joseph, I'm struggling at this point in the story because I'm thinking, we've done everything we could. We're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to follow God. We're trying to obey. We listen to the angels. And things just aren't working out because it feels like no one will make room for us in their life. No one will make room for us. No one will make a way. We're not getting the kind of support that we really hoped and that we really needed. So I want us to take a moment this morning first to look at what does it feel like when people don't make room for you. Now, maybe some of you had experiences growing up where you felt like, yeah, I was kind of the left out one. You know, you were the last person to be picked if it was a sports thing, or maybe you were the last person included if your friends were going somewhere, and maybe you can relate to that. I know that one of the things young ladies are challenged with today is body issues. Statistics say that that's the number one challenge of teenage girls is they struggle with their body and their self-image and who they are and what they look like and what it means to be accepted in the culture. So whether it's I have to have the right clothes or do I look the right way, what does it feel like when people don't make room for you because of your physical appearance or the culture itself tries to tell you you have to look this perfect way and you feel like it doesn't matter how hard I try, I will never look like that. How does that feel? Where people or the culture doesn't make room for you. How about where people don't make room for you because of your lifestyle or where you live? I found it interesting. We live at the very north end of Missionary Ridge. It's not really Missionary Ridge. It's really East Chattanooga. And when we first moved here, we offered to host a couple of different things at our house. And I found it very interesting that people didn't want to come to our house because of where we lived. And I really couldn't understand that. And they said, well, we have to drive through East Chattanooga. You know, those people. We don't want to really go there. And I couldn't figure out what those people meant until I realized it was predominantly African American. And the people didn't want to go through that community. So we faced challenges because of where we lived. I remember we put out, you know, when you move, you can put stuff out on the side of the road here in town and they'll come by and they'll collect it. I remember we first moved in and at that time it was almost entirely an African American community we live in. It's still predominantly that. And we put stuff out on the side of the road, and the older lady in the house next door said, you can't be putting your stuff out on the road. Don't be dumping that stuff in our neighborhood. And I said, well, I just moved in next door, and I'm not kidding you. This is what she said. Ain't no white people live in our neighborhood. That was her perception of the location where we live. So you can make lifestyle choices. I mean, it's not a big deal today, but those of you that have tats, you know that there was a time when it was like, oh no, if I get one of those, I'm not going to be okay, or people are going to look down at me, or I got a nose ring, and that's going to be a problem. It's become much more acceptable, but there's a time when that wasn't okay, especially among certain generations. What about the people we associate with? Have you ever had people question the kind of people you were interacting with or hanging out with, or maybe they weren't our kind of people? Okay. It's funny because I have a friend whose wife was raised on Lookout Mountain, and she spent her whole time growing up on Lookout Mountain, and the only time she ever came off the mountain was to go to school, and then she was driven to school, and then she was driven home. So one day a bunch of us were going to go get something to eat, and her husband, he said, hey, there's a great Mexican or Latino restaurant over here, let's go there. And she said, well, where's there? And he goes, over here in the middle of the Latino neighborhood. And she goes, there aren't any Latinos in Chattanooga. What are you talking about? Because her whole world was the world of Lookout Mountain. She had no idea that there was a whole growing Latino community, primarily from northern Guatemala, but she didn't have any idea that that was going on in Chattanooga. So what does it feel like when people don't make room for you? I saved this one last because there's still some tension over this whole thing, but what happened during COVID? Do you have a vaccine or do you not have a vaccine? Well, I don't think we should be able to do it. Well, what's wrong with you? Do you remember that? Unfortunately, it's not that far ago that we didn't make room for people if they didn't have our particular point of view about what to do about that. Now I want to flip that. Thinking about what does it mean when people don't make room for us, I want us to think for a minute about what is it like when we don't make room for people. We don't like it when people don't make room for us, but all of us at times do the exact same thing. So what happens when someone doesn't have the same political point of view about you? Maybe you're a Democrat and you don't like Republicans. Maybe you're a Republican and you don't like Democrats. So we don't make room for people that have different points of view from us. Or maybe you don't like some particular religious group, whether it's within the larger Christian stream or something else, and you have a hard time with people, and so you either don't understand what they believe and why, or you just don't like what they believe and why, and so we don't make room for those kinds of people. Or what about ethnic groups? Because we don't understand them, or because we don't really have a comfort level with them, then we don't make room sometimes for people that are not like us. What about people that are, Deidre, I hope I'm using the right words here, mentally or physically challenged? Is that the appropriate way to describe that? Okay. She really knows about the whole learning challenge things. So what about people that are mentally or physically challenged, and the needs that they have, or the way that they behave, or the way they act out, we just don't feel very comfortable with that. So if we have a choice, we decide, yeah, let someone else take care of them. What if they're kids? Let somebody else deal with the kids. What if they're kids in our church? We can struggle about trying to make room for people when their life or their particular challenges are things that make us uncomfortable. What about people with addictions or addictive behaviors? What about that person that has an alcohol problem in your family, and you're like, well, we're trying to keep it under wraps because we don't want anybody. One of the most interesting things about the South for me when I moved here from California was this thing about sweeping everything under the rug. I still don't understand it, but it's like we're going to hide all this stuff because we want everybody to think we have our life together. We know we don't have our life together, but we don't want anybody else to know that, so we act like we do when we don't. Still trying to figure that one out. But people that have addictive behaviors. What about people that have drug issues and all that comes along with either alcohol or some kind of drug abuse? Then we have challenges because sometimes we don't want those people in our life. Now, there's a difference between we're trying to be inclusive and we just absolutely don't want them in our life. So I'm not saying we don't want to be inclusive. I'm saying sometimes we find ways to avoid people that make us feel uncomfortable. And then I saved this one for last. What about the whole LGBTQ issue? So maybe you're gay, or maybe you're lesbian, or maybe you're transgender, and that makes me feel very uncomfortable. Not me, I'm just saying it makes me, generic me, feel uncomfortable. So I don't want to be around those people because for some reason I've decided, I don't really get that. I don't really understand why they're that way, so I don't want anything to do with them. So we don't make room for them either. I'm going to tell you a story about that. I, at one time, was involved, much more so than I am today, in a fairly large group of gals who were in the lesbian lifestyle, and one of them died, and they asked me if I would come to the funeral. So I said sure, and because they were all very close friends. And so I got to the funeral home, and this is exactly how it was. I'm telling the truth. On this side, it was packed with people. On this side, it was halfway packed, and then there were 4 pews, and then all the gals in the lesbian lifestyle were stuck at the back because nobody in the room would have anything to do with them because they were lesbians. Okay? Someday someone has to explain to me how we decided that what we think maybe is a sin is more important than other sins. Gee, if everyone in the room has their finances out of control and is in debt and about to go under, do we all sit on this side and do we all say, hey, I'm not having anything to do with you people in debt. You all can sit in the back few rows. How is it any different? So anyways, I came in and I sat down with the girls, and it was just the strangest experience to be in a situation like that where people so blatantly said, yeah, whatever you are, I don't want anything to do with you. So I want to challenge us this morning that the story of Christmas, the story of Mary and Joseph and Jesus being born in the manger, and all that the story of Christmas means as we come out the other side of it, in the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ, all of it, starting with the whole thing in the cave or the stable or the manger, whatever you perceive that to be, all of that really has a message I don't want us to miss this morning. And the message is, the story is about making room for people who don't fit. It's about people who are looked down upon, people who are overlooked, people who are pushed to the margins. It's about the fact that God is as concerned about those people as anyone else. And sometimes what we do unintentionally is we push people like that to the side because in our mind they're not as important as our friends, our co-workers, because they don't fit. And Christmas is a time for us to stop and think for a minute, wait a minute. What does God really have in mind? And what happened to my water? Oh, there it is. I want to use these 2 bottles of water as an illustration of what I'm trying to say this morning as I wrap up, and that's this. We tend to be like this bottle. It's full of water, by the way. It hasn't been opened yet. That's what we tend to be like. I got no more room in my life for anybody that's already there. So if you come along, I'm going to have to tell you, sorry, even if I wanted to open my life up, I don't have any more room to pour anything into my life. Sorry, you're just out of luck. Or we can be like this bottle that's half full. And we can have intentionally left room in our life so that when somebody comes along that we need to make room for, we can open it up and we have at least half the bottle in this case to pour into our life and say, yes, I'll make room for you. Yes, you matter. Maybe I don't understand you. Maybe I'm challenged by some of your beliefs or lifestyles, but I believe that Jesus makes room for everybody. And so that's my challenge to you. You can decide, are you going to be this way where you got no room for anybody? That was horrible English. Or you can be like this bottle, where you made room because you took time to think about, what does God want for me? And part of what God wants for me is to leave enough room in my life for those who are in need. All right, let's pray.